Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Jarrod. Jarrod, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'd love to, Tom, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you. Everyone, my name is Jarrod McAdoo. I'm a director of product marketing over at Ivalua. We provide source-to-pay solutions across a number of different areas, across a number of different materials, direct, indirect, CapEx. I focus in my job over at Ivalua. I work particularly with our solutions, but I focus on our supplier management solutions, our analytics solutions, and also our environmental impact solutions as well. So it's a pleasure to be here to have a great discussion today.
Okay, and just to give people a bit of context, Jarrod, could you tell us a little bit about Ivalua? Where you're based, what markets you operate in, how many employees, turnover, that kind of thing.
Sure. So, Value, we're a global company. We were born 20 plus years ago. We started out in France. Our founders are still our founders, but we've expanded globally. We have offices around the world. We also have several offices in the United States. We have a U.S. headquarters. And the preponderance of our business, it's about 50-50. I'll say about 45-45 between the EMEA region and the North America region. And then we also have an emerging markets in the Asia region as well, also with some LATAM. But, we've been on a very slow and steady expansion. We've been expanding thoughtfully over the last 20 plus years for these items. We're up to about 900 employees now, which is great. I've seen that grow about a third in the last 4 years since I've been there. So we're really moving along.
Nice.
And again, we're privately owned. The founders of the company are still the owners of the company. They started this together. So, even though we're 900 strong and we're spread all over the globe, it still feels like a very close family.
Nice. And in terms of, let's say, global supply chains and sustainable procurement, what are you seeing as kind of the biggest hurdles companies face today in achieving sustainable procurement?
Yeah, I think it's sort of two things, and it's one of these answers, Tom, that I'd have probably given you a different answer 6 months ago, and 6 months from now I'll probably even give you a different answer. But I think starting, when we started looking a couple years ago, it was really coming out of the pandemic. We really had the same thoughts that everyone else was having regarding to resilience within the supply chain, knowing who our supply chain was. We saw our customers facing the same problems as everyone else. I really don't know who my supply chain is, how deep I can go to them for the risk part. Then once we started to come through the pandemic and the issues with the resilience there, then you really started to see ESG come back full circle and those initiatives pick up, especially when we start seeing requirements like CSRD, CSDDD, the German Supply Chain Act, those type of legislations coming through and start to reach the date where it's really becoming a concern for this. So it really became the first problem we saw is understanding who our supply chain is from the standpoint. And now we're transitioning more into, all right, how do I really start to eat this elephant? Because when we talk about something like looking at emissions in our own plants, yeah, you might have a couple dozen plants. But when you start talking about looking deep into your supply chain, you're talking about tens of thousands of entities. So
Right.
it's that prospect of understanding who they are and then crossing that threshold on whose material. How do I make sure that I'm doing those assessments and gathering that data? So it is a lot to there, and I think those are the challenges right now. I think everyone's dealing with it from the supply chain, the procurement side is, really how do I start parsing out the importance when I'm looking at tens of thousands of suppliers on this? So it really moved from an understanding to a data issue to a prioritization issue. Hopefully 6 months from now it'll be something different that will get tackled, but we are starting to work through these problems.
Right. And I mean, when you're talking about suppliers there, you're talking really about scope 3 emissions, for example, as one of the things, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to downplay scope 1 and scope 2 because obviously it's extremely important for organizations. And in a lot of cases, it's some of the most important things you can start with because they're under your control. We focus a lot on scope 3 because, we are a supply chain sourcing provider, but we also understand that because of the numbers I told you and because they're not under your control, that can be the most difficult. So, that's where we think that, we'll have the most problem, we'll need the most help. And unless you get an army of people to help you, you're going to need some technology to help leverage on that front as well. So, that's sort of how we frame the problem in terms of our business and with our customers to help.
Okay, but the SEC are backing away from requiring companies to report on Scope 3. So is it really important anymore?
Yeah, isn't that funny? It's, we sort of come for full circle on that. If we take the SEC out of it, and even before we got that news, I would probably, if you and I were having this discussion, I would say it is important. And, I'll give you some very, I hope, thoughtful points coming out of this is there's no escaping even after the pandemic. And we talked a lot about reshoring, nearshoring, doing a lot of those things. We're still a highly global economy. We can't avoid that. There's no going back from that. When you look at the regulations that are coming out from the European Union, CSRD, CSDDD, there's a lot that's going to need to take into consideration there. You might be naive to think it's only going to apply to European companies, but step two is it's going to apply to those individuals who want to sell into the European Union. And a lot of companies want to do that. So right now that does become, because right there that's one of the largest markets, that does become a global issue whether you live there or not. Now, when it comes to the United States, we can say, okay, well, if I'm in the United States, then the SEC is backing off some of those, but we still have that lingering little state out there in the West, California, which is a large portion of the economy in the United States. Yep. They're driving their own requirements when it comes to this. And I guarantee you, if I'm in the United States, even if I don't think I'm a global provider, I probably want to sell to California. So between just some issues like that, you can't escape the global economy. Even in an isolationist view, you can't really escape a big economy in a big customer base like somewhere like California. So whether or not they take action on it right now, whether it comes 18 months, it will come at some point. You really need to be considering this if you're an organization so you can stay ahead of it, because otherwise you'll be abdicating some very large markets, and I don't think that's smart for anybody's business.
Sure. No, that makes sense. However, though, a lot of organizations will have competing priorities. For example, cost saving, quality, risk management, sustainability. How can companies effectively balance these conflicting goals?
Isn't that just the jewel of it? I know my years of procurement, and as I've sort of made my rounds in the last couple of years talking to prospects and customers and understanding the landscape of this, the one encouraging thing is you're seeing this position start appear in supply chain and procurement. It's the sustainability category manager, let's just say, or the sustainability sourcing manager, which is, really that conduit from the larger ESG organization into areas like procurement. So it's great to have these discussions because then you have an individual that's really framed focusing on areas like Scope 3. So I asked the question is, hey, what are your goals? Well, we're committing to a net 50, or, we're going to be net neutral by 2050 or 2035. And we set up these science-based targets, and we need to drive down Scope 3 emissions. I'm like, that's great. I was like, how about your cost savings goals? Oh, well, they didn't change. In fact, they went up because we need to drive out some of these costs of inflation. And I say, well, how do you balance that? And that's where it really becomes the trick, on this, when you start dealing with those individuals in procurement, is the greenest solutions, for lack of a better term. I know not everybody likes using the green, but just for illustration, they're not always the cheapest. The cheapest ones aren't always the greenest. We're going to have to make inroads in both of the areas. Cost savings aren't going to go out the window. So what really procurement organizations are looking to do in working with sustainability is, how do we balance those and provide visibility to that? How can I, instead of having a single solution, either the cheapest or the most sustainable, how can we look at an array of solutions and decide what's the trade-off we're going to be? We spend a little bit more money in here, but we're going to achieve some gains to sustainability here. Or in this category, we just can't absorb this cost, but in this category we can, so we can go with these solutions. So we're seeing the procurement, they want to gather more data. They want to get this information on products, suppliers. When they go through a sourcing process, then they can start presenting scenarios. And then it really becomes an issue of being able to sit down with management. They'll have the seat at the table and say, here's the trade-offs. We have competing goals. We need to select which one will help us move the bar, across maybe all of these or some of these, and make some very wise business choices. And I think that's where procurement's been really savvy about this, as they've talked about this. They understand this. They've understood these pressures for years. If you're in procurement, they always want it the cheapest, they always want it the fastest, and they always want it the best quality. So they've been receiving pressures for years. So for them, hey, you're just throwing another thing on the pile. So they've been really savvy about, working, discussing their issues with, providers like us as we work through this, saying we really need not only data, but we need insights. We need to have these scenario analysis, and we need to be able to present it. So, I think that's, starting to see the real value of there is, into that sustainable sourcing, we'll just call it there for lack of a better tagline for that, is being able to go through and understand that. So, I find that sort of a procurement geek. I've been doing it my whole life, but, I find that type of thought process strategy very compelling, for the data.
And how is technology helping?
Yeah, I think that the biggest single way that technology can help, on this is, you'll hear me talk a lot about the procurement person, because I have my scars. I've done my time there. The simple fact of the matter is, when you're dealing with something like Scope 3 and you're dealing with a supply base, we talked about the numbers that can be huge. The simple fact of the matter is, as sustainability organizations, procurement, supply chain organizations have to go deal with this, they're not going to be given an army of new people to do this. So they're really going to have a technology that lets them do stuff at scale. Now I say stuff, and then you start asking what that stuff is. Well, there's going to be a lot of data that's going to need to be collected. Just if we look at the regulatory requirements that they're going to have to meet, they're going to have to be collecting data. Where they can't get the data, they're going to have to be calculating data. So there's going to be a lot of those items, and how are they able to do that at scale on these items? And I think that's the first thing technology helps them is, number one, how can you collaborate with a large number of suppliers? How do you really extend that supply chain collaboration in order to get this data to be able to bring this in? And then the next challenge is, how do you make it easy for those suppliers to collaborate? Now, just because you say you can collaborate doesn't mean they'll want to, because they have a lot of customers asking the questions too. So I think of those two main challenges: how do we deliver it at scale, and how do we make it reasonable and attractive for a supplier to do it? And there's a number of different ways that we need to consider doing those type of things. But I think those are some of the first couple challenges when you look at these type of items, to be able to do that. And this all implies flexibility too, because again, not every supplier is going to be as mature as the other. Not every organization is going to be as mature as the other. So there's got to be flexibility in how you address that as well.
Sure. And if I am a supplier and my customer is asking me to supply data, that's reasonably okay, and you've come to kind of expect that. But if I have 1,000 customers and they're all asking me to supply data, and they all have different platforms that they want me to supply the data into, then it starts to become a bit unwieldy, no?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's sometimes we tend, from even a solution standpoint, we tend to look at it purely buyer centric. Like, I could sit down and I could talk to a buyer and say, this is what you could do. You could go ask a supplier to do this. You could send them this link to log in and fill out your questionnaire and get your data. And they're like, wow, that's exactly it. That's exactly what we want to do. But you really need to look at the supplier experience. On the other end, they're sitting there going, wow, look, another questionnaire. It's 1,000 of them that we've got, and they're all different, on these type of items. And then they start having to make priority decisions themselves, on this. So I think some of the challenge to understand is, this is a very fluid market when it comes to, what are the standards, the best practices for gathering this information. Now, there's some standards out there that are growing. For example, EcoVadis, they have a carbon reporting tool. CDP is, recognized as one of the top. A number of corporations already report information into CDP. Now the question becomes, from a technology provider and for a supplier, is, if I've already reported this somewhere, can't you just access it? Why should I have to report it again? And that's some of the challenge too that you really need to look at is, if I go to use a supplier and you've never done this before, can I give you some coaching? Can I collaborate with you? Can I teach you up to try to get you where you're going? But if you're a very mature supplier, can I just leverage something you've already done? Can you just provide me, what you've already provided, or can I integrate with those third-party solutions to get that information in? You can just validate that it does belong to you. And in the case of someone like EcoVadis, you authorize somebody to use it and leverage that. then you become more attractive to that supplier because I have 1,000 requests, but man, this one's easy. So I'm going to do this first on this. And I think the market will mature as we get to more best practices, more standards, more essential repositories. That'll become way more obvious, but we need to take advantage of it now as well, where there still are some of those centers of excellence out there that are starting to emerge. Start talking to them right now. See if a technology can either intake what they've provided or have a real-time integration if it's necessary or available. But there's multiple different ways you can solve that.
Okay, cool. What about the danger, though, of greenwashing? You are talking to a supplier and they say, oh, my carbon footprint is 2. How can they trust that?
Yeah, that's always that's always a danger everywhere. It's funny. I talk about this before. Is I could go out and I can look at some of the most admired companies in the world for their sustainability programs, especially when it comes to dealing with their supply base, and I can find a list of companies, and then I can equally go Google who are the biggest greenwashers, and I can find those same companies, on there, and sometimes it really becomes a matter of perception. I think with a lot of these is, there's this sense that Scope 3 is such a large portion of any organization's carbon footprint, but it's also the most nebulous. Right now, we have such a lack of visibility into it. Some individuals take that lack of visibility or that immaturity as we're working through it is you're hiding something, on those. And that leads to accusations of greenwashing. I think what the real challenge is we need to approach this sort of methodically as we deal with the supply base, understand that there's going to be levels of immaturity, through the market, and how do we deal with this? For example, if I go to a company and instead of just immediately asking them for their admissions, you can start asking some other questions like, do you even have a CSR program? Have you committed to any science-based targets? Those type of things to sort of get a gauge on where they're positioned for that. If they don't have any of those things in place, but they're willing to tell you their exact emissions numbers and say it's primary data, you probably should scratch your head, on those. So you can really start to assess the maturity of some of those as you go through. But then you can also understand some of these organizations might just need some help. They might need some coaching, some collaboration. They might just be coming along. And then we can use other sources like factor data. Say, well, we can come up with an estimate of your product based on some, factor engines to sort of start setting a target. And then we can start working towards more of that primary data with you. So you sort of take them along in the journey on it. But, I think a lot of the greenwashing we see now is I think we just have to be honest with each other. It's a process. We're working through it. Nothing's perfect at the moment, but here's how I'm tackling it. Here's this level of transparency. Here's how we're bringing this along. And then you have other companies where if you get to a primary data on a product, make sure it's a primary set of data that's been looked at, audited, done to some standards that you can have trustworthy with. Because again, it's going to be a matter of you're reporting this. If it's going to be in the press, do you feel comfortable with it? So, there is those challenges on it. It's you want to trust, but, like my old boss used to tell me in my first job, trust but verify. Always trust but verify on this, and really build methodically on this, and understanding it's going to be a journey.
It's still a very immature space at the moment. What kind of advances do you see happening in kind of standardization and accuracy of sustainability reporting?
Yeah, I think I'll sort of start with mentioning it right now is, it's one of this, and this is what I really love about the market when you really get into this, and we saw it a lot with supplier risk as well, and I get excited about that is whenever there's a challenge like this that we're facing, especially when we're talking about something in the supply base, you don't have to look too far before you have a number of people out there who are willing to solve it for you. You can get risk ratings. When we were seeing it with the risk, supply chain risk, you see a lot of individuals in the market who had some very, very thoughtful and very cool solutions to help you manage those. And they're great. And similarly with sustainability and specifically with Scope 3 emissions, you see a lot of people in the market. You could probably go with a simple internet search and probably find a dozen people who will give you a risk score on your supplier when it comes to sustainability on these. Now, not all of them are created equal. You have to really understand what you're getting there. So the market is really rushing in to try to solve this problem, on this. But I think what we'll see is, after you get that initial push, you start to see a lot of those solutions and offerings, they'll either start to consolidate or they'll start to go away. You'll start to see the cream rise to the top on these. For example, like I mentioned to you, CDP, when I look at them, they're a recognized name. People will continue to report on those. I know there's been discussions with CDP and their partnership program about being able to have API access to their information. A lot of these things, so you really see the maturity on those growing greatly in order to get those items on that. So you'll start to see that type of information. You'll start to see the market naturally push back on what is best practices. I think if we leave it to the regulators on what best practice is, holy cow, you want a bureaucrat telling you what a best practice is? That's sort of an oxymoron there. But I think the market will really start to push back on, hey, these are really the best practices. And you'll see a lot of that sharing as we going through. And I think we'll see that mature really quickly. When you look at the sustainability, sometimes it feels really slow.
Yeah.
Because there is such a need in order to meet some of these goals. But when I look at the other parts of ESG, like diversity in the United States, yeah, we have a good diversity program when it comes to looking at that. It took us 50 years to build it. We don't have that type of time with sustainability, and we've really come a long way really quickly, and I think the momentum's growing. So, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see this sort of self-governing solution. I know I've already talked to a number of our customers and prospects, and they're getting together for their industry, and they're defining, hey, when we approach the suppliers, we're going to go approach them consistently. We're going to ask for consistent information. That way we can all use it. So they're starting to set those own standards, and I think you'll see those pockets of excellence, merge up, and then they'll continue to merge, and then hopefully at some point we'll have this all figured out. Hopefully very quickly. So I'm probably too optimistic this morning, but that's what I tell myself before I go to sleep.
And do you think it's important for procurement and finance teams, for example, to collaborate on sustainability and ESG initiatives? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think it's always important. So if we go back to some of the basics, procurement tenets that we have there. So before this, procurement is always measured on issues like cost savings and cost avoidance, those type of things. The worst day you can have as a procurement person is if you're not aligned with finance and you're trying to meet those goals, in order to have those right definitions in there to do that. So, I think a lot of us learned the lessons in the past. How do we find savings? How do we find goals to make sure items are achievable? We can trace those to hard business benefits. And it's going to be the same thing with sustainability. There's eventually going to be a cost of carbon that people are going to use, either because they want to use something internally for this, or the regulations are just going to be requiring them to do this, especially when we look at the European Union. And we're going to have to be in touch with finance on those to make sure that we're aligned as we go through these. So if we're doing this good work in the supply base, how does it translate? Also, when we talked before about trade-offs, like I can't have the cheapest solution, I can't have the greenest solution, there's got to be somewhere in the middle. Those finance teams, those controllers at the plants, if I go back to my days, looking at material, they have to be involved in the process so they can start helping you prioritize those items, because it's going to be, a team effort when it comes to those type of things to make sure everyone's aligned. Again, not dissimilar to back in the day, when we used to see the same things on cost savings, cost avoidance, cash flow improvements, all those type of things to make sure you're pulling the value lever. It's going to be critical, that they're involved. We hear a lot about the sustainability teams. I think you were very astute to, point this out. We hear a lot about the corporate sustainability teams, the procurement and supply chain teams, but finance is always there. They're always going to be involved in this, and they need to be involved in this because they'll help realize, prioritize, and evangelize, these type of programs as we start to see success on them.
Cool, great, interesting. Do you have any big customer success stories you can point to? Any wins where companies have, successfully reduced emissions, for example, using your platform?
Yeah, so it's one of those. It's I'll sort of caveat this that it is a work in process when it comes to a lot of the things we're doing, and I'll say that in a sense is we released our new product, which is our Environmental Impact Center, which really focuses on looking specifically at the environmental impacts of your supply chain. We focus a lot on scope 3 because that's the hot item, but you can also do items like water stress, waste, those type of things. You can measure those as well. and have that collaboration. So that's a new product for us. We've been out over the last year selling it to our customers, working with our customers. We've co-developed it with a group of about 18 customers. We continue to develop based on feedback from our customer base, and we're in a process of implementing a lot of those. But we do have customers who over the years who we've been able to work with just even out of our base solution. There's some information, especially if you want to check out on our website, that we've done items with IKEA, which is, in my mind, sort of the gold standard of where a corporation wants to move to with their sustainability program overall. We've done a lot to work with them to make sure that we're enabling their IKEA way, their sustainability program, gathering their information across those materials, and we continue to look for opportunities to collaborate with them as well. So we're very proud of what they're able to accomplish. We're very proud that we can even be a small part of that to help enforce their vision. So they've done a lot there, and that really becomes a lot of what we've done with their solution is that supplier interaction, being able to engage the suppliers, understand requirements, transmit information, have those type of items in order to do that. So that's how we've met, the call that way. And of course, we have a number of other items in process right now with customers, specifically with our environmental impact solution. So fingers crossed, you and I have this conversation in a couple months after we have the opportunity to go live and start running some data. I'd love to be able to share some more material numbers with you as well. But we're sort of fast and furious working with a lot of prospects and customers as CSRD reporting starts next year to enable them to get the information they'll need and work on setting up their programs, supporting double materiality, those type of items.
Cool. Looking ahead, what kind of emerging trends or innovations do you believe are going to significantly influence the supply chain sector in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think it's the one thing that I'm most concerned about, most optimistic about is, and this probably won't surprise you when I say it, is, AI is everywhere. AI is everywhere when it comes to procurement. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on the use cases, for these, as we look into this right now. A lot of providers are telling the market, here's the use cases where you can use the AI. I think there's going to be a natural maturation where the market's going to come back and say, here's the use cases I want for AI, on those type of items. And I'm very eager to see how we can take that to the next level. And when you really start focusing in on areas like sustainability, being able to, with a click of a button, we can ask AI to do a lot of things, but imagine a click of a button if you were to go ask an AI chatbot to say, hey, can you model my spend with regards to emissions? To start doing some very, some calculations and pulling in some of this data so you can start those materiality assessments. I think that's a very compelling use case, and I don't think it's far away. In fact, I think if somebody focused on it right now and started looking at some of the, the factor engines and available things, you could probably get those type of items. Being able to scrape items off the internet and gather CSR policies, science-based targets, those type of things. Again, it's this wealth of information that we're going to need for this. I really see the application of AI being able to come through there. And I think you'll start seeing some of those other providers as well in the market be able to say is, hey, we use AI to gather a lot of this information. We curate it for you within your business case, and we can expose some insights. So I'm really intrigued by the application there on this. Is I'm keeping that healthy sense of skepticism about AI, but the more use cases I see, the more time we get run under the belt, the more optimistic I am about being able to see some of those solutions in place in order to help this and forecast hotspots and where we might need to sift through this data. So yeah, sort of a long answer there, but I think AI is a big opportunity to make the procurement person's life easier by curating data and making a gigantic data set something that's actionable.
Sure. Yeah, no, AI has incredible possibilities. I think that we're only just starting to scratch the surface of it. For companies that are at the kind of beginning of their sustainability journey, what foundational steps would you advise for them to, head on the right path towards sustainable procurement?
Yeah, I've had this conversation a lot because, again, especially if you're in the United States like I am, we're not exactly blazing the trail here because we don't have some of the burning platforms like you mentioned, with the SEC not having the rules in place versus the European Union where they have rules in place on these. And we sort of have a lot of these discussions, and outside of the framework of me trying to sell anybody something, or talking about a product, but just a couple procurement people talking. When I have this is, the first thing we talk about is, I think you should resist the urge for any single provider to say they have it completely figured out and they can deliver something turnkey on these. It's again, the market's so dynamic on this. Is I really think you really need to focus on sort of the basics on what is our program going to be, what do I need to consider, what's going to be unique to my business. Something as simple as I mentioned, using a factor model to really start modeling your spend base to figure out where your areas of intensity are. Not all factor libraries are the same. You might be in a different industry and you might need to do a different set of factors for that. So I always sort of caution them, is like, be cautious if somebody comes turnkey saying I already have the factor library, everything we just sort of plug and play, because then that gets to be sort of a copy of a copy of a copy, and you start losing that fidelity. Not that there isn't something great out there, but you should really look at taking the time to engage with experts on a program, build a CSR program, look at those type of items, and look for information thoughtfully as you sort of build those items up. And then the second thing is, don't be afraid if you don't have great data to begin with. Again, we're talking about tens of thousands of suppliers, and if you have to start with an estimation of intensity using a factor model, we're all facing that. And it may not be perfect, but it'll get you directionally correct. And it'll let you sift down a very large portion of the supplier base into something that's more workable. And then you can start engaging those dialogues to dial in. So, right now, I think even for me, and when I start having these discussions and talking to my friends in procurement and other people when I get the chance to, is it seems very overwhelming. But, we sort of have to resist the urge to try to solve everything at once, take some steps to go through, understand it's going to be a process, but also sort of cheer ourselves on as you can gain momentum really quickly as you start going over this. And a lot of the things you're going to do can be repeatable. So you can really start moving forward on it. But you sort of have to resist the urge to say, I have to try to solve all this at once. Go through the steps, look at your spend, come up with your program, understand what's important to you, do your materiality assessments, focus on where the juice is going to be worth the squeeze for your limited resources, and then start building successes, momentum, start moving on. You can start replicating those. So, those are the type of the discussions that we have, on these. Because again, sometimes I talk to people and they say, well, what is your plan? They say, I don't know. I just got this job. Our CEO just made this commitment that we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, and I have no idea how I'm going to get there. And I was like, okay, wow. I said, good luck. No, but then we sit down and say, okay, well, let's start building a plan, because I know it seems overwhelming when you put it that way. But we don't want to discourage people from taking those shots at those big goals. And I commend CEOs who do that, because we need to. If we're going to get there, we have to set the bar high. But it's tough for a procurement person when they have to do it.
Exactly, yeah. Cool. Jarrod, we're coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't covered that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
Yeah, I think I would be interested from your standpoint, Tom, is you get exposed to a lot of individuals as well. And I sort of gave you my opinion on how people are looking at this from a regional standpoint. The United States is sort of a wait and see. The European Union is like, I've got to do it. There's requirements coming. But what do you hear from different regions as well? Or, maybe if you hear any input for this on that big looming monster out there that which is really Asia as well, is sort of how they view this as the world. I'm not as in touch there, but I'm sort of asking you the question. You're supposed to be interviewing me on this, so I think I turned it around on you. But I think it'd be an interesting dialogue, is how maybe you've seen that as well, and compared to how I've seen it.
Sure. So what I'll tell you is a couple of things. First is I have a podcast recorded and not yet published. By the time this episode goes live, it will have been published. So a couple of weeks ago, I published an episode with a guy called JP Stevenson, and he works for LRQA. and we were talking about LRQA as Lloyd's Registry. We were talking about just that, because he's based out of Hong Kong, and we were talking about the Asian. So what I'll say to you is listen to that episode,
Oh, yeah.
because we talk all about Asia in that. Follow this podcast, but also Asia has woken up to this. They have, and there's a lot happening in the Asian space as well. So, to your point, from my conversations with people, I would say if I were ranking regions, I would put Europe, as number one. Well, maybe even California and Europe together as number one. Asia a close second, and the US coming in behind. Just given, I would have ranked the US higher had it not been for that reversal in course with the SEC. The initial proposal when it came out last year was very forward looking and even further ahead than Europe, but it got watered down through a lot of lobbying and pushback. The comments that came in from industry were very much against it. So they had to back down, which is unfortunate. But the trend is there. It will happen. It's just been pushed back. So by 2030 at the latest, I reckon all three of the major economic regions, the North America, Europe and Asia, will all require Scope 3 reporting.
I'm so happy to hear you say it, because I sort of had that sense of there was this very strong undercurrent, and it's probably just an undercurrent to me because I don't have the visibility into the region that I hope to have looked to develop, that Asia really was starting to build momentum, that they seemed to focus on this, and it was that. So it's great to hear that, and we'll definitely check out that podcast now. So thank you for that.
No worries. Jarrod, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Yeah, I think the best way, if you want to hear any more about our solutions, specifically take a look at maybe some of our thought leadership and our research on this, because we've done some research in this area. The best way would be able to go to Ivalua, IVAUA.com. You can check out our resources there. Plus, you always have the opportunity to connect with myself on LinkedIn as well if you want to reach out to me directly. I find those interactions on LinkedIn wonderful. Be able to share some information, make some of those contacts. You get some messages. We share some of those items. So feel free to do that as well. But again, check us out at Ivalua.com. We have a number of different resources there, and we would be happy to discuss maybe what solutions need, or just discuss what your needs and perspectives are in the market as well. Because again, one thing I love about procurement most and supply chain most is all these years is our willingness to work with each other to make sure that we drive the industry forward as a whole. So, please feel free to contact us.
Great. Jarrod, thanks a million for coming on the podcast. That's been really interesting.
Tom, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.